We're going over the important military events in the Revolutionary War. Read along. 4 major events: Battles of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Saratoga, Valley Forge, and the Battle of Yorktown. Today we will talk about Valley Forge and the Battle of Yorktown. Valley Forge. After the Battle of Saratoga, the French alliance meant that the colonists would get a lot of help from France. It took a long time for the French army, navy, and military supplies to reach the 13 colonies. Valley Forge was a low point in the Revolutionary War. In 1778, the Continental Army was in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. During the winter, they had little food, clothing, blankets, or shelter. Many died. Many others deserted or left. Valley Forge was the lowest point in morale or motivation during the war. Let's make sure we understand this. The other 3 events that we've talked about or are going to talk about were high points. They were good things that happened to the colonial army. That Valley Forge was a bad thing that happened. It happened because they didn't have enough supplies and the winter was very hard. And it wasn't a battle. It wasn't that they lost a battle to the British. It was that they were starving to death. And they were not able to meet their basic needs. They had a basic needs problem. They had to figure out how to keep going. And it was really hard to do because they had lost morale. Everybody was feeling very upset and disappointed and very sad. And because of that, they started to lose their motivation. And many people left the war effort. So they started losing their numbers for the army. The Battle of Yorktown was a high point. That was actually the battle that ended the Revolutionary War. Let's see why it was such a high point and how the colonists finally won the war. In the War of the Southern Colonies, the summer of 1778, the British Army had split up. Under General Cornwallis, the British were successful in attacking many of the coastal towns, and the British would lose when they would fight in the wooded areas because the colonists were very good at wilderness fighting. General Cornwallis, this guy, figured out that the colonists were winning if they were in the woods, so he brought his army to the coast being along the water. So Port Washington is along the coast. It would be towns like that. And because there wasn't so much wood, the British were more successful. They were having an easier time beating the colonists. So General Cornwallis makes the southern plantation owners angry. The southern colonies, most of them had farmlands. That's why they were called plantation owners. They owned plantations, which were huge farms. And they had slaves that worked their farm. So here's how General Cornwallis got them angry. He offered freedom to the enslaved African Americans if they joined the British Army. The escaped slaves were treated badly, but that didn't stop the slaves from trying to escape. So General Cornwallis goes to Yorktown. The British Army was low on supplies and had many casualties, and General Cornwallis wanted to get more supplies and troops by going to Yorktown, Virginia. His plan was not successful. It didn't work. Let's see why. Fighting at Yorktown. The British troops were attacked by the French Navy and the Continental Army. When the British Navy tried to help, the French Navy defeated them in a huge sea battle. General Cornwallis and his British troops were surrounded. They could not escape Yorktown. It took years, but the British did finally surrender in 1781. Remember, General Cornwallis was trying to stay next to the water and by the coast. So when he was going up by the water, he got trapped because of the French Navy and the Continental Army. The Continental Army surrounded him on the land, and the French Navy surrounded him in the water, and that made sure that they couldn't get help from anybody else. His army was trapped in the middle, and the colonists and the French Navy just kept on fighting until the British had nothing left and they had to surrender. The British after the Battle of Yorktown. After General Cornwallis surrendered, the rest of the British Army did not have motivation to keep fighting. The British Parliament voted to end all of the fighting with the 13 colonies. So the Battle of Yorktown was the official battle that ended the war. Remember, there were 4 important military events that happened to the 13 colonies during the Revolutionary War. Lexington and Concord were important because they were the first battles of the Revolutionary War. Saratoga was important because after that battle, the French joined the 13 colonies and capability, leadership, and resources improved for the 13 colonies. Valley Forge was important because it was the lowest point for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Yet they kept together and became an even better fighting force. Yorktown was important because it was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. It forced Britain to finally declare an end to the fighting. Here are other battles from the Revolutionary War. There weren't only those battles that we just talked about as being important. Look at all of the different battles that occurred. You'll see the Battle of Yorktown is at the very bottom because that is the end of the war. Now let's talk about the Treaty of Paris. The Revolutionary War officially ended with the 1783 Treaty of Paris. I want you to notice that that's 2 years after the Battle of Yorktown. It took a long time for the British government and the new United States government to come together to make a treaty. Remember that a treaty is writing where they work to compromise and come to an agreement. So their problem was solved, finally, by accommodating. The 13 colonies won their independence and became the United States of America, and the new United States gained more land. So they had just had this part, and now with the treaty, they have all of this colored in part 2. This doesn't belong to the United States yet. We'll talk about that later. All right, here's the end of chapter 6. Summary. The problem was economic. The British wanted to keep the colonies to themselves because they wanted to gain money from having the colonies. The solution was dominate. The British would not compromise. They would not accommodate. And they decided that they would do anything they needed to keep the colonies. The colonists were angry and upset, and they decided to fight back. So we ended up with the Revolutionary War. The effect was that the problem ended. The British lost the colonies, and the colonies won their independence and became the United States of America. And that ended the problem.